and it's recording. And now I'm going to, and can you see the screen already still? Chunyun, when I
Yes.
play?
Yeah.
And there we go. And now we're going to go backwards to the beginning. Okay, thanks for coming today. So this is the, what did I hear on NPR? The thing from Harvard. It's the 26th annual first GGSE session on Indirect Costs 101. That's some spoof Nobel Prize award that twice its annual first or something like that. So anyway, Clay is here today. Jamie's here today. These are the folks on campus who manage our contracts and grants, and they're the people who deal with issues related to indirect costs. So I want to put this a little bit into context. Indirect cost is simple. That's what we're talking about today, 101. Unless there's some complication.
Until it's not.
So basically it's kind of like there's, I think, in looking at it, we can keep it simple for ourselves as faculty who are developing grants. We need to know the basics. We need to know what it's about, what it's used for, and what we should or shouldn't be talking about to potential funders related to that. So Jamie and Clay are here today to help us understand that more. And for the future people who are going to be listening to this on YouTube, so it's a broader topic. We may get into this since we're a small intimate group here today, maybe more than we otherwise would have, but we want to have this as part of a bigger picture. It changes, it evolves over time. Anyway, so that's what we're going to kind of cover today. So we're fundamentally today, the basics, Indirect Cost 101 is really kind of focusing on the idea of what is the core base indirect cost related to research grants at UCSB. Trying to understand, like, why is it what it is, and what is it used for, what is its purposes. We'll talk about some exceptions to that, but there is a whole more complex indirect cost structure that we're not going to get into totally here today, but we want to just make sure we have the basics covered. Now, this is just a little reminder that we're going to be having some other meetings related to grant programs this year. Next in January, Aaron Dowdy and I will do an overview of IES grants. So these are people who applied for successfully, some, or just applied for, maybe not successfully, but they're kind of engaged with those funding agencies and try to provide, you know, for what it's worth, what their experience was like, and hopefully some real approaches to try to get funded, and in addition to filtering through our own personal mythologies about why we think we might have got funded and not understanding what the big picture was like. And in February, Emily Doolittle, who is an IES grants officer, is going to zoom in and give us the official spiel from IES about, so you want funding from us? How do we get this done? Which is one of my hopes this year, is that and we have been applying for more IES grants and then are successful in getting them. Those would be, I think, prize awards for us to get here in the GGSE, and NSF, NIH, and foundations. And we see these as possible themes that as we get successful, that will bring people together and their colleagues can share with each other their strategies for trying to and get grants. This is a whole sort of FYIs about developing grants and contracts and managing them. So these are issues that come up in the Contracts and Grants Office, and we're just trying to create communication awareness among our colleagues so that we can talk with each other and make sure that we understand how the granting process works and how we manage grants when we get them. There is a toolbox on the Office of Research website, and they are checking to see IP addresses, and they will let us know whether people from the GGSE have been. No, they're not. And we also do have a website here that has resources. So we're trying to really encourage faculty to check that out periodically and just check for updates. This is, I thought you might like to get a little bit idea about indirect costs. So what do we actually get? So here's an example this past summer. These were the grants that were funded through the Contracts and Grants Office here during this past summer. And you can see the sources, and you might recognize that this is a remake of the slide that I showed earlier when we kind of gave an overview of the past 5 years. So we actually had a little over $1.1 million in funding during the summer. These are the sources of those funding, which reflect our typical profile. County government agencies, probation and mental health primarily, SELPA, school, Santa Barbara County Office of Education, some foundations, Spencer, Get Focused, Stay Focused were the sources of funding during the summer. We've had 2 federal grants that are coming in through IES and 1 through NIH. And then we have a smattering of other sort of UC focused primarily grants. And the SMTRI, is that the one we just went cha-ching with? So just today we actually, MRPI.
Yeah.
So we actually just got one today from the UC Office of the President for like $1.9 billion. I think it was really huge. It was huge. Believe me, it was huge. Believe me. And so those, and then we have a Mexis grant, which surprisingly they're not large, but my group, Aaron and I wrote it, and they're not large, but they're good for partnerships, and they look like you're almost a guarantee to get it. But as far as I can tell, that's the first one we've had from a research perspective. We've had some students get them for like dissertation projects and stuff like that.
So just so I understand this graph, the number at the top of the bar is the amount of
that's
grants,
how much,
and then the number in the is how
much indirect costs we got. And if you know from our portfolio, there's a lot of zero. Like you can see that 26,000 over there came out of one UC project, which happened to be $100,000 with the 26% or something like that overhead. All the others were zero.
Right.
The NIH, you can see $188,000 because, as Jamie's going to share with us, they got 53.5% indirect costs. And the Spencer foundations have 0%. So they're good for faculty development. I mean, there's certainly things we should pursue, but they're not bringing a lot in direct. That one there was the Get Focused, Stay Focused, which was an evaluation contract that Russ and Karen got that had a 15% overhead indirect cost. The SELPA, and then the probation grants are all at 9.4% have been so far. We won't get into all those details. So that's how we're bringing. So we're, so the bigger picture is, can we get more IES and NIH grants? That's what we've been talking about. Hopefully, if we do that, the campus might, we might be able to negotiate a little bit more for resources that we need from campus, that type of thing. But you can see they got, over $200,000.
260.
Yeah, but if I know, when you look at the campus portfolio, these are all federal grants that are all getting 53, most of them 53.5%, which I think when I was talking to Jamie yesterday, figuring it's like over $60 million in indirect costs coming to campus. So, so we're not, who do they listen to, right? So a little bit in the beginning, I just wanted to go over kind of quickly. Partly of these sessions this year, we want to see as trying to attempt to try to get, develop accurate awareness of what our roles and responsibilities are so that we don't step on each other's toes, or when we do, we recognize that we are stepping on them a little bit. But here's what our roles, I found this interesting. I don't know if you're a PI, whether you stop and actually read, well, what am I supposed to do as a PI? Well, this is what the official manuals from the UC Office of the President say. We do the technical, programmatic, and budgetary design of the project. We ensure the proposal is consistent with UC policies and regulations of the sponsor, and all required approvals are secured. So this is kind of our responsibility. It's not just pass it off and let someone else manage it. Accurately completing OR documentation, ensuring electronic hard file copies are final proposal to OR, which related to the 45-day pre-notification we're asking for now. I was struck yesterday, Jamie, what did you tell me? If a faculty member gets that grant in like 10 days, a little bit early, you've got it basically done. You can edit it and do all that. But if you get it in 10 days early or even a little bit more, so Brandon can read that proposal, what did you tell me yesterday?
Well, the chances of getting funded are a lot higher. I mean, we've definitely seen situations where we get a last minute proposal in, we do the best we can given the time that we have, we submit it, and then for some silly administrative reason, usually the proposal's bounced and nobody, like a sponsor from a scientific perspective, even looks at it. So we're really the safeguard to get you through that administrative hurdle and actually into the council review.
And if we do this, we can then have a chance to get feedback to actually craft them in a little bit more compelling way, I think. So I think it's in our self-interest to try to get these things in as early as possible, recognizing that sometimes opportunities do pop up and we've just got to scramble to get the stuff done. Okay, the technical, fiscal, and administrative management of the award in compliance with the terms of conduct of the resulting award, which means we really have to be aware of what we can do or not do within the budget. And we're responsible as PIs to do that. The dean has a lot to do there, or the designee, but ultimately it's the dean's responsibility, at least the way our contracts and grants office is structured. It might be a little bit different on the campus elsewhere. But, you know, eligibility for who's a PI, appropriateness of time commitments, thinking about this, is space available for the project? Are there cost sharing or matching funds involved? Appropriateness of activities within UC regulations and mission? Accountable for all funds administered and establishing procedures for managing accountability. So I think sometimes when it might look like the contracts and grants, or we are kind of being intrusive on the grants, it's kind of a way where we are really, that's what our job is to kind of provide that oversight, not micromanage, but occasionally look over the shoulder and ask, how are things going? Is there something we can do to help support you do your research project better? The campus OR, thank you for being here, Jamie and Clay. This is what they do. Reviews proposals for consistency and compliance with federal and UC and sponsor guidelines and policies. Important because, you know, you do all that work, you send it in and they go, oh, it's not in compliance. And then they don't even review it. That's not a good feeling for anyone. Assist PIs with interpretation, implementation, and sponsor guidelines. So they don't, I know it's sometimes feel like we're telling you what they are, but really we're interpreting them, trying to convey what the guidelines are. Coordinates approval of matching commitments, PI eligibility, expectations, indirect cost policy, exceptions. Talk a little bit about that today. Approves, signs, and submits all sponsored project proposals on behalf of the UC Regents, which is really who we're working for. We're agents for the agents of change, or agents of, what is the one, the Marvel? And negotiates extramural funders and executes agreement boards on behalf of the region. So basically we're doing this, preparing it. Our contracts and grants office is getting all this together. And it's Jamie and Clay's job to see whether or not matches what the UC. There they are, right there. You threw that in there. That was very good. Yes. Okay. And so now we're into the most important part of today, and that's Jamie and Clay filling us in on the indirect cost basis 101.
Yeah. So hi again, I'm Jamie. This is Clay. I'm the Sponsored Projects Officer for the Gevirtz School of Education. I've been here with you guys for 2 years now. Clay, almost 2 years. But I've been on campus as a C&G officer, or in the contracts and grants office, for about 6 years. So I've got a couple years of experience with this under my belt. But yeah, so indirect costs, also called facilities and administrative costs, or overhead. Everyone sort of uses all the terms interchangeably. Different sponsors use them differently. Just sort of be aware they all fall in the same pot. So here's the really wordy federal basis for all of this, which doesn't really help us all that much. It's kind of interpretive. But the OMB uniform guidance, which is sort of that base level federal guidance that applies to all extramural funds that we receive on this campus, basically states that it's the cost that we are incurring as a university for the common purpose for essentially more than one project. So to make that a little more palatable, maybe. So they're just the indirect costs that can't be easily attributed to a specific sponsored project. Kind of restates that a couple different ways. Generally, we're talking about things like departmental administration. Clay and I, our work to get to that point. Oh, okay. Our work to help you get through that process. I lost my slide.
That's why I was just trying to show.
Oh.
So you, oh, you know what? It's not set up right. So
That's okay.
Confusion.
That's okay.
Is it?
Let's see. So let me go back.
Here.
Wait, how do I go back?
I think you would just use the buttons, the directional buttons up here.
There we go. They weren't working for me. Okay. So where was I? Oh, so essentially, I think the last bullet point here is the one I kind of want to hit home here. Basically, we're asking for reimbursement for the sponsor for costs that we've already incurred for the research to happen on this campus. So the cost for both the GGSE and the Sponsored Projects Office to even submit the proposal, that's an indirect cost, which we are trying to recuperate. So it's not, there's some misconception when working with some sponsors. I'm working with a foundation right now who keeps asserting that our indirect costs are profit. It's like, no, it's not profit. We're a taxpayer-funded institution, and we're accountable for our taxpayers. So if we're going to engage in any sort of contractual work with an outside entity, we are obligated to actually seek full recovery of those costs, which includes both direct and indirect. So that's sometimes a fun conversation to have, but that's really what we're seeking here. So like I alluded to, we're talking about general departmental administration, contracting grant administration, development of proposals, all the accounting, all of the payments and travel and personnel and website administration. If you look at our rate agreement, you'll actually see there's chunks of money that go to facilities and to the library and to, in some labs, think about, in the hard sciences, how much electricity they must be using to run some of those machines. We're all inclusive of all of those extra costs. That's what's really trying to be captured here with indirect costs. And Mike's picture that he chose here is a pretty nice illustration. There are definitely things that are direct costs, but there's a whole bunch of stuff hiding under the water that as a university we have to pay for. And so it's rolled up into indirect costs. So just some sort of basics from the budget side a little bit. So we have an IDC rate and also an IDC base. I think a lot of people tend to sort of focus on the rate. Are we looking at getting 53.5, for an on-campus research project? Are we dealing with a sponsor who's limiting that rate to a lower amount? But there's also the actual base, which is essentially just the base that we applied that rate to. Generally speaking, the base is going to be something called modified total direct costs, which I think if you've ever submitted a federal grant, you're familiar with. It has some basics exclusions from the direct costs, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. There are a couple other bases that we do use, but we're mostly looking at that MTDC. And you just apply the rate to the base and we get the total IDC recovery. Pretty straightforward. So actually, let me go back one more. So it really decides the rate, because our base as an institution is negotiated across the board to be MTDC. The rate is what can change based upon the type of activity you're doing. So briefly, I just wanted to talk about sort of the difference between the two we kind of see maybe the most. The first kind of obvious one being research. So all research and development activities that are sponsored by basically any extramural funded or extramural sponsors, excuse me. It includes training. So essentially that second bullet point there is saying it includes the training of our grad students, our postdocs. If they're doing any sort of research with you and receiving any funding for that, we're looking at that being research rather than instruction or other sponsored activities. The kind of way I look at it with research, if it looks like research and sounds like research, it's going to be research. It's kind of our default. To get a project into another category, there really kind of has to be an extenuating circumstance. And by far, I would say the vast majority of our projects are going to be research. The other one worth mentioning is just instruction. These we don't see as often. I think I've only seen them a handful of times. Usually we're looking at a situation where a sponsor is saying, hey, we really think it's important to get a certain population into like STEM fields, for example. So we're going to put out a call, and if you can create and run a course to help women in STEM, we'll support that. So it could be credit, non-credit, something that we actually do as part of our academic year, something that Extension does, summer session, any of those types of things.
So why is it important?
It's because it dictates the rate. So that's where we get into this beastie thing. So this is a quick sort of snapshot of the first page of our UCSB federally negotiated indirect cost rate agreement. It's a mouthful. Essentially what we've done is actually back up a second. We have what's called a cognizant federal agency, which in our case in this campus is Department of Health and Human Services. We work with one of their representatives every probably about 4 or 5 years. We show them this is the cost based on our accounting. This is the cost of research on our campus. We boil that down to a rate and we say, hey, feds, we need this rate. And they say, that's nice, you're gonna get less. So we go back and forth to negotiate ourselves down to whatever our federally negotiated rate is for a couple different categories, and we come up with this document. So the one thing that I always like to point out is it is a negotiated rate. So while right now we're at 53.5 right now for our on-campus research, which is the vast majority of our extramurally funded projects, that's negotiated down. So the true cost of doing research on campus is actually going to be higher than that rate. So we're already accepting a loss even when we recoup our full indirect costs. So you can see we're functioning under that sort of reality fiscally. The regents are really, really strict on accepting anything less than that because we're already accepting a loss. But so you can see here that we have organized research, instruction, and then a couple other categories that are really specific to other projects. Like I said, generally we're living in the organized research land. It is worth noting right now that our rate agreement is actually a provisional state. You can see our last rate expired 6/30/2015. So we're currently in this negotiation process right now and we're waiting on your rate agreement. I think right now we're expecting it in the spring, and it is very possible that it'll go up significantly. We are pretty low when you compare our size to other institutions. I think Harvard's up over 65 at this point, and there are some that are up, especially if they have a hospital associated with your campus, you're up near 100%. So we're pretty low when compared across the board. So I'm expecting this to go up.
So practically, is it the pink sheet we're talking about?
Eventually.
Eventually. Okay, we're gonna get to that.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, I'll get to that. So I guess any questions about this? I don't know that faculty spend a lot of time with our rate agreement, understanding it. It's a really fun 5-page document if anyone wants to look at it. You can see exactly what percentages go where and how much the library gets, so on and so forth. So I added a link there at the bottom if anyone really wants some fun reading. Okay, so the rate and base that we have in our rate agreement must be used for all proposal budgets. And that actually comes down from the Board of the Regents. So the Regents have said we absolutely have to recoup our indirect costs that we spend to conduct research on our campuses. So what they've done is they empowered our OP, it's called the Office of Research Policy Analysis and Coordination. So the RPAC office, who maintains the campus-wide contract and grant manual, has a whole chapter on indirect costs that they just actually updated, I think it was Monday or Tuesday. And it's great because it's actually readable now, so you can follow it pretty easily. So I've gone ahead and again listed the link there so that you have that if again you want some light reading in your free time. But essentially this is the point I guess that I wanted to make out of the whole thing. The cost recovery is necessary for us to maintain our facilities, to maintain our staff. When we're not recovering IDC, some of that becomes compromised. Our ability to hire sufficient staff to actually submit proposals on time can be hard to maintain. The other note that I think is interesting is that the regents are really pushing for all sponsored agreements to actually share the burden of the cost of research across the entire campus. So that's something just to sort of think about a little bit when looking at the graph that Mike had pulled up, where the amount of IDC that you're pulling in is not as high as some of those who have departments who have more federal funding. So the burden share is a little skewed. So like, for example, I have 3 large departments that I serve, and I give the same level of service to all 3 regardless of IDC assessment. And actually, I could even say that as far as sometimes some awards go, sometimes the grant, foundational awards are very difficult. You get no IDC, and then you get a federal grant for $1 million, then I can whip off my desk in a day. So the idea is sort of try to share that burden of all of that work as much as we can equally across all the projects. Let's see. It is a duty, yes, because and like Mike alluded to earlier, we're acting on we're not all acting on behalf of the regents, but we all have responsibility as employees to ensure that we are doing the best we can to ensure those full recovery of costs. And because of that, the policy actually now states that we are obligated to seek full recovery. So that can be difficult, which I'll go into sort of how we practically manage that. But the underlying governing principle is that we're all essentially mandated by the Board of the Regents to do this. So here's what I was alluding to, and as I know this department, or excuse me, school is well versed with, there are definitely sponsors who will not recognize our federally negotiated rate. It happens. Simon's Foundation is a really good example. They not only restrict the rate to 20%, but they also modify the base from what we are used to working with. So it does reduce our ability to recoup those indirect costs. So essentially the university has to say, you know what, we'll absorb the cost of this research and allow it to happen. And so this is what my note here at the bottom is sort of really trying to hammer home. We're prohibited from actually using a sponsor-imposed IDC restriction unless a policy exception has been approved by the Office of the President prior to proposal submission.
Okay, you need to talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. How detailed? Do you want procedure, or do you want?
Well, I'm just wondering I operate from my own practices previously, and being in the contracts and grants office and seeing grants come through now, this would suggest that if you think you're going to apply, if I'm interpreting this right, then that means someone says, hey, I would like you to do an evaluation or something. I want you to apply for this. And you're obligated, have a duty to say, well, that's fine. We have a 53.5%. I'm trying to say how it will play out.
Yeah.
And they would go, oh, no, we can't do that. That if you want to proceed with the proposal, you need to say, well, then I will need to check with my campus first, and you would have to, would you then contact that agency? Because you need, you see what I'm just trying to get? So we shouldn't be saying yes to people about doing this if we have a duty and obligation. I'm trying to, I'm not saying, I'm just trying to describe what I think I see up there.
Yeah, I think
then you know, the county agency or school or somebody says, or a foundation says, you're supposed to go, oh, it's not 53.5, you know, hold off. I need to get, I'll be back with you. I like the idea, I want to pursue it, but I need to get back to you on that. Is that?
I would agree so. And I think what you're kind of alluding to is this right here, is essentially we have three options for the way we can budget for indirect costs in a proposal. You can use the F&A rate agreement. You can get an approved exception based upon sponsor policy prior to proposal submission. Or on the rare occasion, we can work through the process of securing not only the Office of the President's approval, but also our campus VCR or Vice Chancellor's for Research's approval to utilize a rate that is not our federally negotiated rate based upon vital interest to the university. And that is a rare situation. In 2 years as an officer, I did the first one I'd ever seen this week. So it is not common. But I think what you're alluding to is this note at the bottom. So this whole process for 2 and 3 has to be done prior to submitting the proposal. And so if you ever get even an inkling of a sponsor, you know, somebody you want to work with needing to or wanting to reduce that rate, tell us. Because it is not a quick process to do the exception. We have to secure the appropriate documentation, which is sometimes not easy. Sometimes we had one recently that took 3 months for me to actually get somebody to respond to me and give me their policy. Then I have to look at it, and then I have to make the case essentially to the Office of the President that this is an appropriate exception to make. And then it's up to their timeline. You know, they're stretched thin just like all of us are, so that process could even take longer. So you can see we're condensing that all really quickly before proposal deadline. It makes it really hard for us to be able to do that.
So can I ask for clarification?
Sure.
I was kind of thinking the way I described it and what I'm hearing you now, the way I think we work is like some entity would say, hey, we'd like you to do either as a foundation or a government agency says we'd like to do something. go ahead and prepare a proposal that goes through our contracts and grants office. We know that they think they know they're saying it can't be 53.5, but we've actually prepared a proposal.
Oh, and send it to my office.
And send it to your
I
office.
see what you're saying.
And should we do that?
No.
And tell the agency, you know, this may or may not go through. So that's what I was trying to get clarity on.
I understand what
on
you're
the steps.
So, I mean, from my perspective, a proposal is without any, how would I say this? It's not actionable until it's submitted by my office.
Yeah.
So there can be all types of conversations that may or may not be happening, but until it's endorsed by my office, it's not official. So to make it easier on everyone, the sooner any of us know that there's an IDC restriction, the easier it is for us to be able to help.
And you can act on that
Prior to receiving the
prior
proposal.
to actually
Absolutely.
getting, you say, you know what, this
Absolutely.
is coming up, and they're saying they want 15%.
Yep.
It looks like, but now they're saying only 5.
Yeah.
And you can then work it out with them, and before anyone does any work on the proposal and everything
Correct.
about this is going to work, it's all set. So once you submit the proposal,
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, and Kelly and Lupe are really good about this process. I think you guys have done it so many times now. But usually a foundation or a sponsor is in the business of getting grants. They usually will have somewhere on their website or in some published policy that this is our rate, this is our base. There you go. And some smaller foundations may not. They may not have it anywhere available. We'll have to go directly to one of the representatives and say, what is it? Make them confirm that it's not some sort of ad hoc, one-time only sort of thing. That this is their policy. So to get that in place before you start putting the budget together and investing all this time is really important.
Yeah.
so that's really important because
Yes.
I'm not sure how everyone else is. I hadn't thought of that as a process. I thought I put it together. I think I think it's not going to be 53.5%, and I know it's going to have to be worked out. But then you do all the work. Kelly does all the work.
Yeah.
Everyone does all the work, and then expectations get put up to here that it's actually going to happen before that gets clarified.
I think part of that is we're finding on campus that there seems to be a bit of a misconception among faculty that the proposal has to be in a final state when it comes to us. We want as complete of a proposal as possible because then we actually have the document like enough to review to ensure as many mistakes are caught, but it doesn't have to be final. So I think there's sometimes a tendency to hold on to things too long, and then we get on the day we're due, and it's like, well, I can't look at too much now, but you gave me your draft 10 days ago, then we can talk. But if there's any issues ever with a proposal that you're even considering, be it IDC or a PI exception or anything like that, we absolutely can help before the document is come
So here's
over to
what,
us.
so I'm actually trying, we want to try to encourage faculty to actually have
I'll
that
let you
done
have that.
because we think that's actually has value because it
Yeah.
actually will lead to more successful grants. But we understand and are flexible, right? But then, so if we actually are notifying our contracts and grants 45 days ahead, so before we actually have submitted, that's kind of one of the things we're hoping would come out of that.
Yeah.
One of those questions would be, do you think this is not 53.5%?
Yeah.
That would give us some time
Yes.
to contact you and say, we're looking at this and they're going to be developing a grant proposal. Can we get clarity on this matter before we get way down the line? Does that make sense?
That makes sense.
Okay.
Well, it seems like there's 2 categories though on the front end. I know we talk about 53 and not.
Yeah.
There also seems to be a 53 and a 26 that on the front end are pretty simple for you folks in terms of whether it's on campus or off campus in terms of the indirect rate.
So,
And then it's anything that fell below that would enter into this special category.
Yeah, so if it falls on, basically if it falls in here, it's a lot, generally speaking, easier. I know there's going to be a whole separate session on the on-campus versus off-campus designation, and we can dig more into, maybe at that time, actually more into sort of the organized research instruction and like where those lines are. But that process is one we're very familiar with and doesn't require us to go to the office of the president to ask for any exceptions or to secure any additional documentation from the sponsor. Where the other one, it's a whole documentation process. There's a whole separate online system we have to go into, data entry. It's a whole thing. The other thing I do want to note is we have access to not only every single exception request that our campus has ever submitted for a sponsor, but we can actually see all UCs.
So there may be a sponsor which you've never worked with before, but we have the ability to see, what did Berkeley do? How did they handle this? Did they have a contact there? So there, and same with like, you know, so you buy Spencer 1 year and then 3 years later you buy Spencer again. You know, we have all this historical data, we have all these contacts. A lot of this can be pretty smooth as long as we just know enough in advance that we're going to have to do the process.
Yeah, if you get an inkling that the IDC is rate and base is fuzzy and it's not readily available and you're not getting a clear answer from the sponsor if you're asking that question, then it's better to get us involved as soon as possible.
And I think this is really, really, really important, because this is the one thing that can really bog down the grant process of anything. Oftentimes it's not the, you know, whatever, the scientific merit of what we're doing. It's the procedural things. The other thing is, Shane, your comment, we want to have more conversations this year about that, but you know, when we fill out the form, there's the thing, what is it? Researcher? But I don't know that we give a lot of thought to that, but our thought to that is related to the table. So when it's a matter of what are you doing, research, instruction, whatnot, accurately describing that, and if you do that, it will dictate then what part of that table you go to. What we've done in the past is we've gone and looked to the table and go, oh, 9.5 to 4%, I like that. Yeah, that's what I'm doing. And that's really not, well, it's happened, but I'm not, now that we're aware of it, I just don't think it's going to.
And to be honest, there is a significant audit risk there to the entire campus. What was it, Duke or Princeton? I can't remember. It was one of the Ivies was just audited, and they had to pay a substantial amount of money back to the federal government because they were incorrectly classifying projects as off campus when they should have been on campus. So part of our responsibility is to maintain consistency, not only within your school, but also with the entirety of campus. And that gets sometimes a little tricky because the nature of your research is very different than, like, we have the Marine Science Institute is another one of our departments. It's very different, but we still have to apply the rules across the board. Otherwise, we're in substantial audit risk.
So I wanted to ask, like, so for Cam, are some of your activities fall under instruction as opposed to research?
Most of my activities.
And so when you pay indirect costs on your projects, if you get them, they're that other rate.
They should be that other rate.
Yeah.
They aren't. Oh, I mean, I'm learning a lot. This is 101.
Yeah, I know, but this is.
Yeah.
Well, and what Jamie said is the default should be the on-campus research. If that's anything other than that, it needs to be justified.
Right.
So that's the.
Well, I think that's the important thing is up front being prepared to provide those justifications and such, again, given the nature of the work, and in particular in the schools and such. And I think it's relatively, well, there's others that have parallels, but unique in that sense of if literally 98% of what's happening is happening in the schools, then I think, you know, creating that justification is something, but it needs to be done on the front end as opposed to.
Exactly.
Yeah, we have to, I think that's why we wanted to devote a whole section to that, I think, to talk about and get some examples about, like, well, how has that actually been defined? Because it's actually just an open-ended form you fill out. It's not like,
Yeah, the on versus off campus.
Yeah.
Right. There's actually, it was funny this morning that we're on, like, 20 different listservs, but there was a whole bunch of chatter this morning across the country about the on-campus versus off-campus and working with actually a federal sponsor. So this is something that we invent that same distinction. Which is it supposed to be? How do you make the determination? I mean, we were all at our level having that discussion over email today. So it's definitely, it's a tricky one. It's not always abundantly clear.
Yeah.
But the more information we have, the better we can help.
Right.
You know, tease that out.
Yeah, and I wonder too if it's a source of, because I could imagine that sort of discussion going on with sort of a federal discussion. That's an interesting one. But again, as it intersects with that education domain, I think when you look at a lot of state funds, county funds, and then the reality is that once you add in those percentages on just a natural project that's happening in the schools, what they quickly discern is, well, we can actually hire a full-time position for less than what you folks are offering because of that element. Whereas when you go to the 26%, it gets you closer to them seeing the realities that there's value added with the preparation, graduate participation, those sorts of things.
I won't get into that, but I think the example, the cell phone contract you have has
Yeah.
a 26% now.
That-
The salary that's coming here is paying students who are out in the
And it
field
pays the
working.
students, yeah.
And that's, I mean, there's general ideas. ISBR on their website says it's off campus. PI is 51% out in the field. So whoever's getting paid is 51% of their time or their salaries out in the field.
Mhm.
That's their way of doing it. I don't know if that's the way or only way, but
That's
It's pretty close
it's
to
pretty
the
close to it,
way.
you see.
It's pretty close.
51% of the time that they're spending?
So what we do generally, as a general rule, to sort of start us with this discussion, and again, we can go to this more later, the other class, but it's the salary effort charged to the sponsor.
Yeah.
If that effort represents 51% time off campus,
Right.
then we would start looking at it as an off-campus project.
Right, because
Right,
that's the
so for
same for like
example-
the faculty involved in that project too. Like we're meeting out there, we're in those offices, we're in those schools, as opposed to they're not coming here, we're not doing the work in this building.
Right, but this would be good to have a discussion. Like,
Yeah.
for example, data's being collected out there, but all the reports and everything else are being done here.
Yeah.
Where's the time being spent doing this?
Right.
Yes, someone could be out collecting data 100% of the time. Our time here, writing reports or meetings here and students' meetings here, because in principle, if it's out there, then it means you don't need any. The reason it's 26% is you're not drawing upon the resources, the indirect costs that are drained off
And
campus.
so 26% is an artificial cap that every single institute in the US has. We are all capped at 26% of our, I think it's administration
Yeah,
costs.
for administration.
Yeah, for administration costs, which means our costs for administration, again, are actually higher. So the feds are already capping us at 26% there. So none of the facilities. So you can see why this whole idea of where the salaries, where those people actually working starts to play into, okay, do we need to then charge the facilities on top of that? But really think, I mean, it's again, the different disciplines. So with the Marine Science Institute, we're looking at off-campus projects there because they are in Argentina for 4 years running this project. They're not here. They're not using our facilities. You know, so some of this gets
Right,
a
the same
little
logic
more
holds. They have
challenging.
these data sets. I mean, I know several colleagues who do exactly that work, but
Yeah.
so the same logic holds. There's a time when, yes, they physically have the computer in this building and they're working with graduate students, but the fraction of that time relative to the amount of time that the project's going on is so small that then you warrants the 26%.
But again, related back to the salaries that are actually charged to the sponsor. So
Yeah.
that little
Yeah.
piece there sometimes gets a little tricky.
That's
Right,
interesting.
providing one
Yeah.
grant, and we're saying we're 10% time on the grant already. And then arguing that
It gets tricky when you only start, when you sort of start to hyper focus into that, it starts to get
Yeah.
tricky. And usually at that point, we look at it as much as we can, and then we sort of open it up and go, okay, hold on. What kind of project is this? What is the intent? What kind of, are you here writing your reports that are due to the sponsor?
Perhaps.
And I think it becomes very project specific very quickly, I think.
so some examples, and maybe, I don't know if the Office of Research would entertain us with the idea, but we're in the School of Ed, by definition, our field is out there all the time,
Yeah,
basically.
exactly.
It's not like.
There's no lab on
like
campus.
laboratory
Exactly,
work.
yeah.
So that I would be open to try to see if we can have a little conversation with the Office of Research to help us think about this, because
Yeah.
otherwise we'll make something up. But I would hope we make something up, try to be internally consistent, that partly it's been on a case-by-case basis. So someone comes in, oh, sure, it's off campus, but there's no consistency about that. So
I agree. I think you have the justification there for doing it. I think we just have to come up with what that looks like for your discipline.
And then-
Because I think it's there.
you're talking about the templates. Now, it wouldn't be the same for everybody, but some examples, like you were talking about the institutional thing,
Right.
examples like that. Well, if it's off campus, here are some ways that you think about that, justify it. So it's not like, yes, just do this in it, rubber stamp, but it's like, you need to think about these kind of principles and ideas, and then how is that manifested in each specific project?
And part of that, again, is back to the audit risk. I mean, if we were audited just like the other university would, we'd be asked for, well, why is it off campus? And then we pull up the lovely piece of paper for the auditors and say, see, and they go, thank you, and they walk away. So as an
So
institutional
you're
official.
saying you don't have to actually have a good reason, you just have to have a reason.
I didn't say that. No, because I think you have a valid reason with your type of research. I
Yeah.
think it just needs to be documented.
Yeah, the salary is not a one size fits all metric. I
No.
don't think.
Yeah.
So it's a recommended at the contract grant, chapter 8. If you look at it, I think it says like salary is a can be a metric used, or like, but it doesn't say that it has to be. But
I think
we typically
yeah.
But that would be like a person, it's not maybe, they would be assigned to a site, like someone would be, like in their
Maybe.
case, they're assigned to a school.
Maybe. Yeah, we'd have to look at it.
Or they're running a
It's
program, an intervention in the school, and it's on the school, and they're there 10 hours, 15 hours,
Right.
and they're paid really to do that.
Yeah, it's
So, but in our case, because that's our real laboratory,
Yeah.
that would be, so that.
But that also folds into then research space being assigned in the building. Because
Right.
if you're doing all of this in the field and you want 3 research offices,
Yeah, then, yeah, because we don't cut down our research. If we're out there, we still don't argue, I don't need research space.
right,
I've never seen anyone say that.
yeah,
But yeah,
full picture.
having said that, as a whatever justification you might want to use, it has to be reasonable and justified. You can't just something.
So we need to talk more with you about that and just in general
Yeah.
about this issue. But the whole idea of instruction and research, it's important because how we define our work has implications to make it easier or more complicated with respect to indirect costs.
The other thing I realized that I didn't put in slides, but I do kind of shifting gears a little bit, I do want to make sure I mention, is that the indirect cost rate is not based upon the entity in which we are directly receiving the funds. The IDC rate is going to be based on who is ultimately providing the money. So if it's an IES grant to the county, for whatever reason, to us, we're not utilizing any sort of county restriction. We have to utilize the ultimate source of funding. And that gets tricky sometimes because a lot of the foundations and people that I've seen in the last 2 years that you guys tend to work with will have a tendency to try to wash the money clean and call it their own and not let us know who it's coming from. And that's dangerous for 2 reasons. One is that then we have absolutely no idea what rate we should be using, which is a giant audit risk. So we could inadvertently be like, sure, we'll use your reduced rate, come to find out later it was federal money. Like that's not good. The other problem is that if they're washing the money clean, they're trying to wash the terms and conditions off of it too. Federal money is still federal money regardless of how many hands have touched it. So if we're receiving federal funds, we need to know that because we are bound to treat those differently than, somebody says, Packard says, here's 100,000, have fun, tell us what you did at the end. It's 2 different
So I'm
circumstances.
starting to get a sense as we move forward that if it's research 53.5%, good. You can go forward. You see the terms and conditions from the federal government. Anything other than that, we really need to be thinking ahead of the schedule and actually trying to not negotiate with an entity, but to say we need to understand, we think, someone from the university who represents that to the community is going to communicate with you so that we know where we're at and what we need to do before we can move forward.
And like I told Mike, my job is to negotiate with the sponsors. Just send me an email. Don't do my job for me. Don't do it for free. That's part of what I do and what I'm here for. So I am happy to engage them and get that documentation. That's no problem. The only other thing I'll say too, because we sort of said the federal money coming down. The other one that's newer this year is actually state funding coming down. And that is one that I have a feeling is happening here more than any of us realize.
What's coming down on that one?
So as of the first of the year, the UC system, the CESU system, and the state signed a memorandum of understanding that said from now on, every single agreement is going to be in this template. When that happened, the UCs and the CSU said, great, we're going to get our indirect costs then.
Okay.
So right now, for this year, the indirect cost rate for all state agreements is 25%, and it's going to go up, I think it's 5% every year until we hit 40%.
Wow.
Because there is so much inconsistency across the state in regards to indirect costs. I mean, it was an administrative mess. It was a financial mess.
That one will be very relevant within the context of the schools because pretty much all of that state funds.
That's right.
And it's gonna drive. It'll be interesting to see if that will help or not.
That's why I have questions about that. What's an example of state funding that would affect? I mean, where schools get funding from the state and they want to.
Right, because
So,
the district.
okay, yeah, I see what
And
you're
does
saying.
this put us
It's-
out
it's
of, I mean, what does Wested get 40%?
Well,
Is
so
that why the
it's-
CDE contracts out with all these, research firms and not the university? Oftentimes?
I would have to have more information about that. I'm not sure. I mean, I don't know that we've seen a reduction in funding by the state by any means. If anything, I feel like it's
Well, not
gone
right
up.
now, but if you play it out as that
As it
increases
goes up.
5% every year for the next, what, 3 years? then you
Yes,
get to
yeah.
40.
So,
Yeah,
but
we get to
the
40.
bigger points, we need to know the flow through,
We
whether
need
it's
to know the flow
federal
through.
or state, before
Yeah.
you know that. So when we're working with entities, we don't know that. They just tell us they want to work on a project, but we shouldn't get into like, well, what, do you have an indirect cost rate or anything like that?
No,
Because
exactly,
We don't
exactly.
know, but we need.
But if somebody's like, oh, you're one of 3 partners because we're applying for an IES grant, like let us know that, because then we can go dig through what that actually means for us. And the same with the state. But going back to the state question, so it's not like the state receiving, a state-funded school receiving state funds. We're talking about somebody who's received a contract from the state to do a defined statement of work, and they're taking that and they're having us, evaluate their program.
Like that would have been, wasn't that like with the challenge dollars, where those considered
That's right,
state?
exactly.
Because those are
You know,
federal
years ago we had
flow-through.
them, they were coming down from the state. And
They were state.
And we
yes,
weren't getting, back in those days, they don't even know how we did them. We weren't getting a lot of overhead, but now
Yeah.
they would be at this higher rate because they're state directed funds.
Yeah.
That's what I was, exactly what I was thinking.
And again, as with other sponsors, there is a process at Office of the President to go through an exception process for state agreements. That one's a little more tedious because it's a new agreement. It wraps into this whole template agreement that all institutions are using. We have to pull in the entire CSU system, because if we accept an exception on this campus, that means it's all UC campuses and all CSU campuses. So it can be done, but it's tedious.
So will agencies like the county government be aware of this fact?
No. And the county is
They probably
probably,
received a memo.
the county is probably the biggest culprit for
I have no idea,
watching
though.
money. The county is the one that I sort of wonder the most about, the sort of cleaning the money off and saying it's just theirs. That's my guess is it's probably happening there a lot. But I mean, we can only all do, it's just basically I'm asking you to do your due diligence. I mean, it's really all it is. I mean, we're not gonna go, running after one of our sponsors, shaking him down for it, but.
Right. One other question I'm curious about in what you were sharing earlier and describing about what indirect IDC covers, what the rationale is.
Mhm.
The one that I didn't see listed, and I've come to sort of think that it's not in there, but that it's not included. So some universities are offering, like if the graduate student research appointment is made, then they provide a fee waiver. And then initially I thought maybe they were running it through their IDC dollars, but from what you're describing, that would not be the case because they are not meeting the needs of the greater good or something?
It's not to my knowledge that that's a direct category in our indirect cost recovery.
Okay.
It is possible, like for example, your school gets some of those dollars. It's possible that those dollars, once they get down to a control point, are turned into a situation like that. But to the best of my knowledge, it's not by any means a line item there.
Okay.
I mean, there is like a line item for student support, but I believe that that's more like registrar and BARC and financial aid and, keeping all of those sort of things
see.
functioning.
Okay.
No.
Yeah, because I've always wondered if it was a function of where the IDC dollars go, or if it's a function of, like, if it's more like the regions of California, UC regions have to decide that that's an okay thing to do.
I would have to look into that more. I'm not well versed in fee waivers myself.
But I mean, what if we had $10 million of federal funding?
Right, but
We'd have, the campus would get $5 million in funding, but look at it, it's still a sliver of the bigger pictures on campus.
Right.
I don't know then, the dean might be able to say, no, $1 million would go a long, long, long way compared to the $18 million lab that we built across campus in terms of student support. That's right. I think the potential is, if we can move towards this more, we can move towards that. Are there other questions, or do we have another slide?
Oh, I think you're gonna put me on the spot.
So that's the question. So Jamie, what is the role of the PI in determining the indirect cost rate?
I love the face. Categorizing your project correctly. Is it instruction? Is it research? Do we need to have an on-campus, off-campus discussion? And then just giving all of us a heads up if you get any sort of inclination that it's going to be a flow-through situation or that somebody's going to want to start talking about imposing an IDC restriction.
So it's a really important role. It's not a role in actually determining what it is, but we can provide information that's accurate, leads towards it, and gives you a chance to do whatever you need to do to negotiate or talk with the entity to get it set.
Exactly.
And should we just go to number 3?
Yeah, I think 2 and 3 are kind of the same.
Yeah, kind of the same. Optimally, if not 53.5% indirect cost rate, how would the process proceed? How would CPI facilitate the process of what to do and what not to do?
I think we've kind of hit you over the head with this a little bit, but just let us know. I mean, we'll work with the sponsor, we'll get the documentation needed, we'll do the legwork to get it through the office of the president and move forward. The only thing I would note is that with a vital interest waiver, that is an extra step where we will ask the faculty member to author a memo justifying the rationale behind actually asserting that this is of vital interest to the campus community. And in that case, the process is a little longer because then I need to send it through my vice chancellor for research, who may or may not be even on campus, and then up through OP. So that's a little longer, and it will involve an extra step for the faculty member.
And so these are rare, so obviously
Rare.
I wouldn't, even though I stayed at Holiday Inn, I don't know what I'm talking about, but I've asked the question related to that, the vital interest. It sounds like those would only occur when the sponsoring agency doesn't have a policy, or is unwilling to budge on something. It's not like you can say, oh, we'll take that. So you have to actually, they're saying, for example, no, even though our policy is 20%, we're only gonna give you 10. And you're like, well, so the only way to justify that is to say to the UC, this is some extraordinary value to the university, and that's why we choose.
And that happens sometimes. A lot of our smaller foundations will have a policy that says, like, you can have up to 20%, and then a program officer is like, well, you can have 10. Like, well, the region says the interpretation of that is 20, so we have to ask for a waiver for that 10% difference. There are occasions, and I gave Mike the example yesterday, where there are programs where the faculty member decides to seek a vital interest waiver, a lot of times for student support. So we have a long-standing program on campus that's totally funded, which is not actually going to be allowed anymore with the new regulations. But previously, the Department of Justice would give $100,000 to run a summer program to take kids abroad and teach them about all the different religions of the world. And so our faculty member said, hey, that's great. Wait a second. If you don't assume IDC on this, then I actually can support twice the number of students, and we can increase our enrollment in this and get more students through this program. The university looked at this and said, you know what, that's a vital interest to those students who are in that PhD program. It's worth us assuming that loss to keep that enrollment high. That's a really good example of a vital interest waiver. It's our mission is education. It makes sense logically. You're like, sure, that's great. So that's another example.
So thank you, Chen Yun, for checking in, and Clay and Jamie for enlightening us on this important topic. So a lot of these topics we're covering this year, I think, are at one level seem a little mundane, but the other point, I think, the more we're aware of this, I think it really will streamline our process of applying for grants and minimizing the number of issues that come up. And of course, minimizing issues mean we're all happier and getting along together.
And getting funded. I
And
want to
getting
see you guys
funded.
get funded. I want more work.
So I think clearly from this, for me, I'm hoping that if as we start to use the pre-notification form, we'll get that right away. And that way, now that I'm more aware, and I think we're all more aware, I'm going to follow up immediately to make sure that we're on top of matters like indirect costs or other special requests that we have to make sure that the grants get through as efficiently as possible.
That's one of the buttons on the form is it going to be something other than 53.5 so that can trigger starting to, look at that of what steps do we need to do.
And we'll follow up on that immediately, along with other issues that we can see to try to jumpstart the process and to make sure that we're being responsive as possible to make sure that the grants get through in a smooth way. And that doesn't require any sort of a lot of pre-thinking for the faculty. I think when they do the form, there's nothing on there that that's unknown. Everyone knows their name, everyone knows their email, and so on and so forth. So it doesn't require a lot of work to provide that information, but it will help us to understand if we need to talk earlier to make sure that we get to Jamie and others that need help. And we want to thank you all for joining us today for this exciting ongoing series in the Contracts and Grants Office at UCSB. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, folks. Have a good day.
Okay, thank you, Shane.
No,
Thank you, Glenn.
I used to tell Mike to do this quick wrap up like this.
And February, when the IES person comes.
Or no, the, for the other IBC one,
Oh, that's
February
right.
2nd.
Yeah. Well, after these go out, is it?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.